Now we're going to go on an extensive field trip to the Navajo Reservation. And we have three major vehicles for this. First is the film Skinwalkers that you have an assignment on, and it's in films. And the assignment basically prepares you for the book, which is our second vehicle, First Eagle, because it gives you a sense of the scenery and also the three main characters in the movie, Jim Chi, Joe Leaphorn, and Janet Pete, also appear in our major characters in the book, which occurs several years later than the movie. And the third vehicle, I humbly offer myself. I've been to the Navajo Reservation every other year for the last 10 years with students. And before that, I've been there doing work in various places on the reservation. My first contact act with the Navajo was actually in Alaska, where I was and you weren't, because we worked with a Navajo couple who taught at the Navajo Community College, and they got us invitations down to the reservation. Now, you see in the middle, I think you could see my little arrow of the Navajo Reservation, Hopi Land. This is very significant because when you do field work, you have to look at the context as well as the environment. And the Navajo and Hopi are traditional enemies, and placing them on the reservation was a form of punishment by the US government. And also, the size of the Hopi reservation within the Navajo reservation varies depending on who the government is punishing at the time. You also see places like Shiprock, which we're going to look at as part of the origin stories, Farmington, Tuba City. All of these are part of the book. And you see, it's not far from Flagstaff. My trips also go to the Grand Canyon, which is very near it. So buckle up because I'm a terrible driver, and let's do this trip. Coyote is always out there waiting, and Coyote is always hungry. Indeed, Coyote stories are a part of not only Navajo tales, but many native tales. The coyote is a trickster. It is always a contest between the coyote and the humans to get their will. And if you think that's something remote from you, coyotes have been spotted in the last few years in Brooklyn, in Jersey City, in Newark. Ooh, and look out your back window. Yep. So the tribal lands, and this is a bit misleading because the lands that the Navajo were forced on after the 1868 treaty really border four states: Arizona, the bulk of it, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. And again, these are not where the Navajo originally settled, although it's part of their territory, but resulted in a very forced treaty in 1868. This is Shiprock, which we're going to talk about later. And you can see it's the form of a ship. It's a holy place. This is some of the terrain. It's beautiful, but try to raise crops there. It's pretty hard, but that's what we do. As a nation, we shove Native Americans into terrible spots, and then if valuable things are found underground, we either move them or we take away their underground land rights. This is a traditional thing. These are sheep. Now, one of the origin stories, which you're going to hear in a minute, is the Navajo came from the center of the earth. This is Adam, a Hopi, actually, not a Navajo, who was one of our guys. It was fun. We got guides who were Navajo and guides that were Hopi, and they would tell us very different stories. Now, you see this bottom picture is hollow, and that's because this is where, according to Hopi and Navajo mythology, the people came from a lower earth to the current earth. Now, you think my road trips are fun. They are, but sometimes I make the students do things. Here they're lifting up a boulder. we have a story that is kind of hard to believe. God made the earth in 6 days and took, because he was unionized, he got Sunday off, made a guy named Adam. Adam was lonely, so he took Adam's rib apart and made a woman. And that's our story of creation, sort of. Navajo have a different story. They have two major stories. Here we go.
Before this world existed, the first world lay in darkness and emptiness, with the exception of 6 beings. They were First Man, First Woman, Salt Woman, Fire God, Coyote, and Begochitty, the child of the sun. Begochitty first created 4 mountains, white in the east, blue in the south, yellow in the west, and black in the north. But there was still no light. The first beings grew tired of this and decided to leave the first world. At the center of the first world, Begochitty planted an enormous seed, which grew into a tall, hollow reed. He then gathered all his creations and crawled inside. The reed grew out of the first world and into the second. The second world was white and blue. When the first beings emerged from the reed, they found a nicer place to live, but it was already occupied by the cat people. The first beings and the cat people fought for years and years, but in the end they couldn't overcome their differences. Again, Begochitty collected his beings and returned to the hollow reed. The reed grew on and on into the third world. The third world was yellow, beautiful, and full of light. The first beings rejoiced and built camps and had many children. Begochitty created rivers and lakes and mountains and all kinds of animals and birds. The first men and women lived there happily. One day, as Coyote was walking along the river, he found a baby, the child of the water monster of the third world. Coyote stole the baby and hid him under his blanket. When the water monster discovered his son was missing, he was furious. He sent vast rainstorms from all directions and flooded the third world. Begochitty and his creations ran back to the hollow reed to escape and forced Coyote to give back the baby. But it was too late. The third world was entirely flooded. Finally, the waters rose to the base of the fourth world. Locust helped to carve a hole into the next world, and all of Begochitty's creations crawled out to set up their houses again. Begochitty created mountains and set the moon, sun, and stars in the sky. This world was not as beautiful as the third, but it became the home of the Navajos. Begochitty taught men and women the right way to live, how to plant corn, squash, and beans, and how to give thanks for their harvests.
So, more believable than Adam and Eve, less believable, some familiarity. Many cultures, including ours, have stories of floods. Many cultures say that the worlds aren't perfect, again, or aren't the best. Think about Adam and Eve lived in paradise, got thrown out of the Garden of Eden, and then came to a place that wasn't as perfect. So, but again, look for the differences too, and the connections to this, to the soil, to the corn. So that's one story. And here's their second story. This is Shiprock again. These are our students in front of Shiprock. They are cold. Okay. And here's their alternate explanation. So they have two origin stories.
Shiprock is called Tcbidai in Navajo, which means rock with wings, or simply winged rock. The formation figures prominently in Navajo Indian mythology as a giant bird that carried the Navajo from the cold Northlands to the Four Corners region. Ship Rock is a sacred mountain to the Navajo people that figures prominently in Navajo mythology. The primary legend tells how a great bird carried the ancestral Navajos from the far north to their current homeland in the American Southwest. The ancient Navajos were fleeing from another tribe, so shamans prayed for deliverance. The ground beneath the Navajos became a huge bird that transported them on its back, flying for a day and a night before landing at sunset, where Ship Rock now sits. The people climbed off the bird, which rested from its long flight. But Cliff Monster, a giant dragon-like creature, climbed onto the bird's back and built a nest, trapping the bird. The people sent Monster Slayer to combat Cliff Monster in a Godzilla-like battle, but in the fight the bird was injured. Monster Slayer then killed Cliff Monster, cutting off his head and heaving it far to the east, where it became today's Cabazon Peak. The monster's coagulated blood formed the dikes, while grooves on the bird drained the monster's blood. The bird, however, was fatally injured during the Great Battle. Monster Slayer, to keep the bird alive, turned the bird to stone as a reminder to the people of its sacrifice. It stands today as Ship Rock. Other Navajo myths tell how the people lived on the Rock Mountain after the transport, descending to plant and water their fields. During a storm, however, lightning destroyed the trail and stranded them on the mountain above sheer cliffs. The ghosts or Chindi of the dead still haunt the mountain. Navajos ban climbing it, so the Chindi are not disturbed. Another legend says bird monsters lived on the rock and ate humans. Later Monster Slayer killed 2 of them there, turning them into an eagle and an owl. Other legends tell how young Navajo men would climb Ship Rock as a vision quest. Standing on the Navajo land, Ship Rock today is a testimony to the resilience of these native people.
Now, before we get to a different myth, it's really important to notice Ship Rock does stand alone, the rock itself. And there's many other rocks like that. These were formed by floods and rivers millions of years ago. If you want to know more about that, take my course on evolution in the spring. However, there's graffiti on every other place except for Ship Rock. And even teenagers respect the holiness of Ship Rock. Now, here's another myth. And notice we shouldn't use myth, we should use origin stories. That there were several gene flows from East Asia. People migrated across the Aleutian Islands. There was a land bridge for a little bit, and then they came into North America. And we have a lot of evidence to prove this, scientific evidence. But I'm going to show you a video how our science, quote, is myth, and their myths to them are science. And also, I'm nonviolent. I've been protesting wars since I was 14 or 15. But this guy you're going to see in the video, I would love to punch in the face. He's just so arrogant.
I'm off to meet an ancient tribe. We trace their family line back to Siberia, to the ancestors of the Chukchi who made that first migration into the Americas. They're the Navajo, and they live here in Canyon de Chelly, Arizona. The Navajo Indians have been living in North America ever since their Chukchi ancestors first arrived. Canyon de Chelly is one of their most sacred sites. I wanted to tell them about the genetic trail that had led me to them. But I soon learned they had migration stories of their own. Hey, thanks a lot for inviting me up here to your place. You're welcome. Enjoy it. It's gorgeous here.
We're glad to share the information about our place here.
Can you tell me a little bit about the place? How long you've lived?
This is the junction of Canyon de Chelly. We got this piece of land from my great-grandfather.
This is our hogan.
Yeah.
We have a story of where we came from, and our story, our origin, is a very sacred stories, and it's passed on through generations, and that's your life and your way of where you came from. And I'm sure that these two has some other information too.
Phil Bluehouse explained.
Well, adding to what Letty has to say, there is a creation and journey narrative that we go back to, and this narrative is quite sacred. It talks about the event of creation. We call that Hajine in Navajo, or at the time of beginning.
Do you have any stories about where the ancestors, the ancestors of everyone may have come from?
It depends on how you. There are discussions about migrations. I mean, when we migrate from our mother onto the earth's surface, that is a migration narrative. I mean, we come from one being to another. That's a migration. And we believe that we were created here in the Four Sacred Mountain area. This is where we came up from the ground. In other words, we were birthed into this place, just like we are all birthed by our mother.
I also have my own sense of what that story might be using science. I'm a geneticist. And everybody around the world is very closely related to each other. We're all part of one big family. In fact, we're all related to people who lived in Africa as recently as 50,000 years ago. That's only about 2,000 generations.
Yeah.
So you have distant relatives living all over the world who are essentially African. And you yourselves are essentially African. So am I. Can I show you some pictures of some of the people we've met?
Yep.
These are people known as the San Bushmen who live in southern Africa. And they are some of the oldest people on the planet.
Are these the people that have that clicking sound?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, exactly. Fascinating people. Now, the evidence is that the first people who left Africa followed a coastal migration route along the south coast of Asia, and they ended up in Australia. The Australian Aborigines. We visited them.
So you're basing this on the genetic trail.
Exactly.
Now, these people who were in Australia, they mainly were more together as a group, you know, like
More cohesive.
more cohesive. And
There are lots of different populations in Australia, speaking very different languages. They have different cultures, different myths.
Why do you call something that a people will tell you a myth, as opposed to an experience that they had and they relive it over and over, rather than calling it a myth? Would be able to call it something else, because I have a real strong feeling about that. That, you know, if you call something a myth, it's a substandard event that does not
That's a
have
good
any
point.
relevance, because they are real as we understand them. They're not myths. And
Absolutely. That's a very good point. And my bias as a scientist is that I like to see evidence for things.
Yeah. Okay.
So that was the first migration out of Africa, according to the genetic results that we got. Now, the next one followed a slightly different route, one that went inland. I'm getting pretty good at this. Of course, it helps that I brought the family album along. And this man is a direct descendant of a person who lived in Central Asia about 35 to 40,000 years ago.
Wow.
And his ancestor is also the ancestor of most Europeans and Native Americans.
Wow.
He's a man called Niyazov, who lives in Kazakhstan.
Are you the same person that did some research I noticed on the internet that says that the Native American people are somehow connected to
Yes.
Central Europe,
Yes, Central Asia.
Central Asia?
Yeah, that was a paper that we published last year.
Okay. That's good to know.
What do you think of that?
You know, and I was looking at a book from people from Central Asia, and I saw my cousin Emmett and Abraham, Auntie Grandma Buggy, and I said, my God, I got family over there in Central Asia. These were the
People like
Mongolian
this.
people.
yeah.
Central Asians.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's it right there. In the eye, he looks like Oriental, and then he's got Negro features to some extent, and also Caucasian, kind of all mixed together. That's interesting. Very interesting.
These are the Chukchi people, and they're your
They're still
distant
in
cousins.
Siberia.
They're still living in northeastern Siberia. I visited them recently
Oh, they're the ones that have
the reindeer.
with the reindeer. Yeah.
Reindeer.
Uh-huh.
I've seen them on TV.
Their home is.
They're
Yeah, the home looks like a teepee. And the results show that they are your ancestors. They ultimately made that trip across the Bering Strait into the Americas.
Wow. About how tall were these guys here?
About 5'8", 5'6", 5'8". Yeah,
About
not too
tallest.
tall. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And by looking at the genetic data, we can estimate that as few as 10 or possibly 20 people were in that first group, the first wave of migration into the Americas.
Yeah.
My story about the journey of man came as no surprise to these Navajo. The idea of migration had been central to their own creation story since the beginning of time.
The point is that somehow we're finally saying, acknowledging one another from the scientific realm and from the traditional realm, saying that, yeah, the puzzle is starting to fit together.
And we complement each other.
And we're all complementing each other.
So I think he got schooled a bit by the Navajo on this. First, I hope you notice that the first people that he started with were the song, and they talked about their clicking noises. He also got schooled or got canceled when he referred to the Navajo story as a myth. And the Navajo rightly came back at him and said, a myth is a loaded term and it means substandard. And then the guy got very defensive. Well, I have genetics, I have science. But what he didn't have was an understanding of the people. And that's really an important part of anthropology and cultural relativism. You have to understand what people believe. And in the book, you're going to see a discussion of skinwalkers. And this is the book First Eagle. And Joe Leaphorn doesn't believe in them, but he learns very quickly when he becomes a cop in the power of beliefs. And that's important. But I just love that when they turned the tables on him. You also saw the reference to TV. Even the houses without electricity have satellite dishes. So TV is everywhere. On this last trip, we went to a village that had no electricity by religion, okay? But they had TV because everyone had a satellite dish. So here we go. Just a very brief Navajo history. In the 1500s, they lived in the Four Corners. And actually, they joined with their enemies, the Pueblo and Hopi, and threw out the Spanish for a little bit. But then the Spanish came in and pushed them into the desert off their traditional lands. 1848, this is in italics, Mexico ceded the land to the US. We stole it. We started a war with Mexico, forced a settlement, and all of Arizona, New Mexico, most of California, Utah, and Colorado, all of a sudden became the United States. And the people in it became second-class United States citizens. Want to learn more about that? Take my class in the spring on ethnicity and race. The Hopi and Navajo continued their warfare because now they were kind of trapped together over scarce resources. Kit Carson, who was a famous hero in the 1950s, what? He lived in 1860s, yeah. But all these guys were brought back as TV heroes in the 1950s. Most of these guys were psychopathic killers like Jesse James and Wyatt Earp and Kit Carson. Under the guise of a peace conference, he imprisoned the Navajo leaders, killed their livestock to create starvation. Now, many of you probably heard vaguely of the Trail of Tears that the Cherokee were forced to take in the middle of winter by President Jackson, where 8,000 made it and 4,000 perished when all Native Americans were ordered west of the Mississippi. The Navajo had their own long march in 1863, 64, and thousands died. And then the Treaty of 1868, which you see a graphic up there, was forced, where they were put in limited land, and that Navajo and Hopi were put together. Now, this isn't very important. We have a Bureau of Indian Affairs, but until the 1990s, there was never a Native American in charge of it. The first commissioner was a man named Francis Walker, and talked about we have to break the Native Americans of the habit of the chase. They are festering sores on civilization. They are like children, they need discipline. They cannot escape work, they cannot stray off the reservation. They can be trained and reformed. And he said, this is the guy in charge of them. They represent the lower and baser elements of civilization. So I talked a little bit when we talked about the Apache, about the Indian schools. This began for the Navajo and Hopi in 1871. The Dawes Act is incredible. In 1887, the federal government began this policy. The lands of the Native American were communally owned. They said, they're now individually owned. In the next 40 years, because of this, 60% of the land was lost, taken over by whites. The way they did that is taxes were charged to the individuals and inheritance tax. So many Native Americans cannot hold on to their land. In 1903, the US Supreme Court ruled that any federal government could terminate any existing treaty. So even the treaties that guaranteed Native Americans' rights were taken away. Between 1905 and 1923, oil, gas, uranium, and coal are found under the lands. Now, because they were under the lands, the leases, they didn't belong to the Navajo, and they were granted to outsiders. Also in the movie, you'll see that uranium has really killed many, many Navajo in the movie Skinwalkers. 1934 was the Indian Reorganization Act, where the Navajo lost self-determination. Now, the federal government wanted to build a dam up the Colorado River, and they forced the Navajo to thin their herds by killing 250,000 sheep and goats, saying that they could raise no more than 6 per acre, which is not enough to live on, forcing them into poverty. And the reason they did this was the Navajo were against the dam and the Hopi were in favor. So in 1936, the Hopi territory within the reservation was increased. And again, it was a trade-off, but it was again forcing the Navajo into poverty. In the 1960s, the leases were renewed. In the book, First Eagle, you're going to see a man, Officer Kingsman, who's really angry because there's a forced partition of the Navajo and Hopi lands, and a lot of Navajo were trapped in Hopi territory. And again, a 90% reduction of livestock. 1977, what looked to be a promising thing, the Navajo Generation Station was formed, and it was the largest employer on the reservation. We'll see what happened to that. And it was also owned by outsiders, which meant the profits went off the reservation. The Navajo and Hopi fought so much that a fence had to be put between the two tribes. And they got a constitution which gave them semi-autonomy in 2006. Now, some of you might have heard of this, and I'm not going to go off on this very long, but Navajo language is very, very distinct. And they were used as code talkers, radio operators in World War II because the Japanese could not crack their codes. The Basque language in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, part of Spain, but not according to the Basques, I think they're Basque country, is another group whose codes could not be talked. Want to learn about their languages? Take my class in evolution. But they were not given recognition by the federal government until 1968. And then Reagan did Navajo Code Talkers Day in 1982. Back to the reservation. Traditionally, they were isolated sheep and cattle. Now, when we talk about how does the environment influence people, Because the land is so sparse, the Navajo cannot live close together because they need area to raise their sheep. They get wool from that, meat, and blankets. In the 20th century, mining, coal, and uranium became part of their economy. And because it's on a reservation, they were not subject to OSHA safety regulations, more diseases. About 60% of the Navajo today rely on tourism, arts and crafts. And until recently, they rejected casinos. And you'll see why and how badly the casinos have harmed the reservation since they were finally put in. Now, here's a little bit about the Navajo and how the federal government was treating them in the beginning of this century. You'll see Senator McCain there, and you'll see the tribal leader of the Navajo who was forced out by corruptions, as has 4 of their last 5 presidents. But this is really, really significant.
First up, the Navajo Nation stretches for over 25,000 square miles across parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. Treaty signed in the 1800s split the Navajo's territory, leaving them to live in desert terrain considered worthless by the United States government. Turns out the same land was discovered to be extremely rich in natural resources. Between the old treaties and the U.S. government red tape, the Navajo Indians have little control over gas, coal, and even their own water. Today, more than 40% of its 300,000 residents are without running water or even electricity. America's Now contributing correspondent Nina Donahue takes a closer look at why many Navajo people are living in third world conditions in the middle of the United States.
The Navajo people believe they're custodians of the elements that surround them. The earth, the wind, the sky, and most sacred of all, water. Maintaining harmony with the environment is at the core of their culture. But a new Senate bill sponsored by Arizona Senators John McCain and John Kyle grants water rights to the Navajo community.
In exchange for legal waivers, the Navajo Nation would receive critical drinking water infrastructure.
But also benefit some of America's most powerful mining and energy companies. Back in Arizona, residents like Don Yellerman feel they've been excluded from the decision-making process.
The people are very upset. They feel that they have taken a position already. We have been basically accepting what's been offered to us for too long and not challenging and stepping up to the decision making and saying these are our demands and this is what we insist on having.
He's concerned that implementing new regulations will lead to a repeat of events that occurred 200 years ago, when treaties were set in place that redistributed Navajo land.
Need Senate Bill 2109, McCain and Kyle.
Not everyone is against the McCain bill, however.
Are you guys going to quiet down, listen?
Navajo Nation President Ben Shelley sees deals like this as a chance for the reservation to modernize and grow economically. He stood against many of his constituents by supporting the bill and feels some people have been misinformed.
Everything, anybody's against something because they don't understand. They didn't take part in it. They want to be a part of this, and if you don't know nothing, then you say no.
Shelley argues that for the Navajo Nation, outside investment equals more independence for a community that all too often loses its young professionals to life outside the reservation.
They're doctors, lawyers, and all that, but when they come back to the reservation, there's nothing there for them to go to, so they go off the reservation.
The reservation's second largest urban area is Tuba City. Its Navajo name means scattered or winding water. And here, some pockets of land over underground streams flourish. But residents on the outskirts have no way of accessing nor purifying the water. Many are without running water at all and rely on local wells or haul tanks of water for themselves and their livestock. Despite the scope of their communal land, farming is almost impossible due to lack of water access. Tuba City Councilman Joshua LeVar Butler says some aspects of the bill will continue to sell people short.
The people have an issue with water and the acreage of water that we are going to be limited to. It was supposed to include a Western Navajo pipeline, and it was completely deleted out of the bill.
Another sticking point for Butler is the inclusion of 40-year leases for existing local power companies, the Navajo Generating Station and Peabody Energy. Peabody extracts coal from the Black Mesa escarpment that dominates Tuba City. But for local residents living in its shadow, there's a complex rationing system to obtain coal, and much of the supply goes out of state.
For many years, they have extracted coal from Black Mesa. They built a railroad to the generating station, to the power plant, feeding the coal there. They're burning it there, and a lot of that electricity is then transported down to Southern California, Las Vegas, Scottsdale, Phoenix. Meanwhile, we have people here on the Navajo Nation, even within a 50-mile radius of these power plants, that don't even have the luxury of flipping a switch for electricity or turning on the faucet for water.
Many areas on the Navajo land lack even the basic infrastructure to harness their own energy sources, leaving most people dependent on outside, federally sanctioned companies. Well, as you can see, there are massive power lines cutting right through the reservation, but for many residents here who actually prefer to live in more traditional housing, you can see a Hogan house right behind me. They actually have to hook up their own power lines to the ones above to have any kind of electrical supply at all.
We finally got electricity and running water and cable and a telephone. So these are the kind of conditions people have lived in. And they remember.
For constituents like Sarana Riggs, the bill and its implicit deals with outside power companies interferes with the fundamentals of Navajo culture.
As a Navajo person, this does go against every being, every fiber of our being in our Navajo traditions. In Navajo tradition, it goes into our own creation stories and how we were brought up. We're here as protectors. Yes, we do need the infrastructure. Yes, we are educated. We have degrees. We went to school. We're in a mainstream society, but we also think of our own traditions, and that reflects everything. Everything is based on tradition. We're here as protectors of the earth, and that ties into everything in life. That's the main thing we always look at first.
For Sarana, the intrusion of these outside companies is an affront to her way of life.
It affects us traditionally, culturally, spiritually.
The Peabody coal mine does employ over 400 local people, but one natural resource that once brought jobs is having lethal consequences.
Uranium is a very big problem.
Abandoned Cold War uranium mines built to supply the US government's nuclear program, many left open for decades. Tommy Rock from the Navajo Environmental Protection Agency showed us just how close uranium debris from the Skyline mine in Monument Valley is to homes, and how, as a result, residents close by are suffering health problems.
Mostly cancer. The people complaining about cancer, people complaining about their livestock, what kind of effects are coming from their livestock.
Residents and their livestock depend on communal wells, some now too contaminated to use.
In Old Jitsu chapter, there are 2 wells that were pretty high with the uranium, so they were shut down. And we're telling people, or the public, to use regulated watering point to get their water. Not a lot of people that live in this area have access to potable water within their home.
David Holliday's father worked on the Skyline mine.
My dad used to bring back a jug of water container. And he would say, boy, the water is so cold down there. It tastes so good. And from the mine, and we drank that. and not knowing that there was a lot of radiation in there.
His father died of uranium-related lung problems. The government compensates workers, but not their relatives who may also have been exposed.
Their fathers or husband brought back what was on their suit, uranium, dust, mud.
The US government pledged a 5-year plan to close and clean up Navajo Nation's 500-plus uranium mines. The cost, billions of dollars. But unpaved roads and rough terrain is working against them.
The problem is the cleanup, the cost of cleanup. As for Skyline, the problem is getting the equipment here just to clean this up. It would cost a lot of money just to bring the equipment up and fixing up the road.
Navajo Nation knows it must somehow harness its own natural resources in order to catch up with the rest of the United States.
We need to begin thinking into the future, 100 years, 200 years into the future, and make sure that we do have the water that's needed to sustain the future. And as far as uranium, we do need to bring that to the forefront.
A desert land once judged uninhabitable and worthless has proved instead to be rich. But its loyal Navajo custodians still don't have the means nor the rights to profit from nor protect their environment.
First up, the Navajo.
Okay, before I go on a little bit, I just want to say that she talked about the conditions, and you're going to see more about these in a minute. If you read the little profile I did of myself in our Blackboard outline, you see that I've been to Africa, Asia, Central and South America. What else we got? Alaska, Bloomfield, and Hoboken. I've never seen poverty like I've seen on the Navajo reservation. And again, OSHA, the EPA, none of these federal agencies cover the Navajo. And it's just horrible, horrible conditions. Now, there's about 300,000 Navajo today. To be considered a Navajo, you must have at least one grandparent Navajo. Unlike most nations, 58% still live on the reservation. Usually it's well under 50%. And 1 out of 8 Indians in the United States happen to be Navajo. But here's the reality. Suicide rate is 30% higher than the national average. And this is due to alcohol, depression, and the many unfair worlds, which you just saw a video of. 56 live under the poverty line. Unemployment is high in the cities and out of the cities. The lack of telephones and electricity has gone up. Now it's 53%. 20% lack plumbing, and the average family income is $4,100. Just another way to give you that same information. It is poverty, and it's in the United States. Native Americans have one of the highest fetal alcoholic syndromes recorded. Mortality among teenagers is 5.6% higher than the rest of the United States. And alcohol is a factor in 56% of all suicides on the reservations. Incarceration, hopefully you've talked about Black Lives Matter, about the unfair treatment of African Americans by the police. Native American youth are 30% more likely than whites to be referred to juvenile court and have their charges dropped. More likely to be killed by the police than any other racial group, including African Americans. Native American men are incarcerated 4 times the rate of white men. Native American women are incarcerated 6 times the rate of whites. And Native Americans fall victim to violent crimes more than double the rate of any US citizen. And this is really important and has gotten worse with the casinos. 88% of violent crime committed against Native American women are carried out by non-Native perpetrators. The last hope. The casinos in almost every reservation are a disaster. The exception are the Poudre casinos in Connecticut, which are really controlled. Technically, they're supposed to be owned by 51% of the Navajo, but that's only a paper ownership. Nationally, 75% of the jobs in the casinos go to non-Indians. In the Navajo, it's led to higher deaths through drinking, auto-related deaths, more violence. As white men come in, they are more likely to be drunk and attack Native American women, more crimes by outsiders, and the money has not filtered down. Now, we talked about the power station before. It closed in 2017. It was one of the largest employers on the reservation, and it had brought back some of the educated. And the royalties had accounted for 25% of all Navajo Nation income. But as the nation shifted to coal, there was less use for this. And fracking has become big on the reservation, which has led to earthquakes and many destruction of sacred sites. The richest area for resources is called the Black Mesa. And because of the Navajo-Hopi feuds, they haven't done any development there. They were supposed to force settlements with housing, paved road, electricity, but none of that has occurred. And of course, the Navajo of any group in the United States has the highest rate of COVIDs in the nation. And it has only 12 healthcare facilities over 27,000 square miles. They had to cancel their August election. Tourism is basically dead. The casinos are empty. And there's a lot of pre-existing conditions which lead to fatalities, heart disease, diabetes, obesity. These just show the increase. This is really frightening. It's going up and up across the United States, but in the Navajo, just horrible. It is closed. Monument Valley, where we spent a lot of time last January, well, in January 2020, you can't even go in it anymore for good reasons. Now, you heard about the Hogan, and that's very important. You'll read a lot about it in the book First Eagle. It's not a sacred place, but it's where Navajo live. And it's a house with very prescribed rules. The east is where the door is, open to greet the sun. And when you read about Jim Chi, you'll see every morning he leaves his hogan, which is really a trailer, and spreads pollen to greet the sun. Men sit on the south, women on the north, west is for guests. And if someone dies in a hogan, you never enter it again. You seal it up. And you see Chi's uncle, grand maternal uncle, Sam Nakaki, dies, but he knows he's dying, so he gets outside of the hogan so it won't have to be closed up. That's a traditional death hogan, boarded up. A usable hogan, one under construction, traditional, and a modern hogan. Okay, so next you go to the film Skinwalkers, and you have an assignment on that. You have an assignment on this PowerPoint, on this YouTube. Then you go to read the First Eagle.